The rain came first, not the soft, forgiving rain of home, but the kind that turned earth into soup and turned hope into something you had to dig for with your bare hands. December 1941, and the world had just caught fire. Pearl Harbor still smoldered in the American imagination. The Arizona still leaked oil into the harbor like a wound that wouldn't close, and across the vast blue violence of the Pacific Ocean, a new kind of war was being born. One fought not just with bullets and blood, but with mud and distance and the slow, grinding entropy of the tropics. The soldiers who arrived on those first scattered islands, places whose names most Americans couldn't pronounce and wouldn't remember, discovered an enemy more patient than any army, the jungle itself. It swallowed tents whole. It rotted canvas before you could finish tying it down. It filled foxholes with water so fast you could watch your position disappear. Supplies arrived soaked, ruined, useless. Medicine spoiled. Ammunition corroded. Food became a memory. And overhead, the sun, when it wasn't hiding behind apocalyptic clouds, beat down with a hatred that felt personal, turning metal too hot to touch and men into shadows of themselves. The American military machine, for all its industrial might and engineering genius, was losing a war against weather. And in the frantic corridors of the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks in Washington, someone finally asked the question that should have been asked months earlier. Where the hell are we going to put everyone? The answer, as it turned out, was freezing on the windswept edge of Narragansett Bay, in a place called Quonset Point, Rhode Island. It was January 1942, barely a month after Pearl Harbor, and the world felt balanced on a knife's edge. In Europe, Hitler's armies had swallowed most of a continent. In the Pacific, the Japanese Empire was expanding like a flood. And in a drafty workshop near the water, a small group of engineers and naval architects huddled around drafting tables, their breath visible in the cold air, their coffee perpetually lukewarm, their mission impossible. The Navy had given them 60 days. 60 days to design a building that could be mass-produced by the tens of thousands, shipped across oceans in pieces small enough to fit in a cargo hold, assembled by men who had never held a wrench before, and strong enough to survive typhoons, artillery fire, tropical heat, Arctic cold, and everything in between. 60 days to invent a miracle. The men who gathered in that workshop were not famous. Their names would never appear in history books, but they understood something fundamental about the war they were fighting. That logistics wins wars as surely as courage does, and that before you can defeat an enemy, you have to survive the ground you're standing on. They began with what they knew wouldn't work. Traditional construction, wood framing, brick, concrete, required skilled labor, heavy materials, and time measured in months. Tents, as the reports from the Pacific made brutally clear, were worse than useless. What they needed was something that defied every convention of architecture. A structure with no interior supports, no foundation requirements, no complexity. Something a sergeant and 6 privates could assemble in a day with nothing more than a set of instructions and a handful of bolts. Something that would stand in a hurricane and laugh. The breakthrough came not from some flash of inspiration, but from the patient logic of necessity. One of the engineers, history has been unkind to their names, but kind to their work, sketched a simple arc on a piece of paper, a half-cylinder, a Nissen hut turned inside out, improved, Americanized. The genius was in the simplicity. If you made the curve from corrugated steel, and if you made each panel identical, and if you locked them together along the ridge, the structure would support itself. The curve would redirect wind. The corrugation would add rigidity. The interlocking panels would distribute stress. It was, in the language of engineering, elegant. In the language of war, it was salvation. But theory is one thing. Steel in the winter air of Rhode Island is another. The first prototype rose in that Quonset Point workshop like the skeleton of some prehistoric creature. Ribs of corrugated steel arching up and over, each panel bolted to the next with a precision that left no room for error. The engineers worked through the night, their welding torches throwing shadows that danced across the curved walls. The smell of hot metal mixed with the salt air blowing in from the bay. Frost formed on the windows. Coffee went cold in forgotten cups. And slowly, impossibly, the thing took shape. 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, 24 panels of corrugated steel, each one weighing just enough that 2 men could carry it. each one identical enough that you could swap them out like playing cards. The genius was not in any single innovation. It was in the system, the repeatability, the fact that once you'd built one, you could build 10,000. When the first Quonset hut stood complete in the gray dawn of a Rhode Island morning, the engineers walked around it in silence, hands shoved in their pockets against the cold, studying the thing they had created with the critical eye of men who knew that lives would depend on their work. It wasn't beautiful. It looked, frankly, like a tunnel laid on its side. But when they loaded it with sandbags to simulate a hurricane, the structure didn't even creak. When they threw everything they could at it, wind, rain, the full fury of a New England winter, it stood. They had done it. They had created a building that could be anywhere, survive anything, and be assembled by anyone. They had 60 days. They'd done it in 42. By March, the first production line was running. By April, Quonset huts were leaving American factories by the hundreds, broken down into numbered pieces, packed into crates, loaded onto ships heading west across the Pacific, east across the Atlantic, north toward Alaska, south toward the Panama Canal. The scale of production was staggering. Thousands of huts every month. An industrial ballet choreographed with the precision of a military campaign. Factories that had made water towers and grain silos retooled for war. Steelworkers who had built bridges now built buildings that could travel. And on distant shores, on islands whose names Americans were just learning to pronounce, the first Quonset huts began to appear like steel mushrooms after rain. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Guam. Each island told the same story. Ships arrived, offloaded crates, and within days, sometimes hours, a city of curved roofs rose from the jungle. The soldiers who assembled them worked with the methodical intensity of men who understood that every building they raised was one more piece of order imposed on chaos, one more small victory against the entropy of war. The Pacific Theater was where the Quonset hut proved itself. In the Solomon Islands, where rain fell with such violence it sounded like artillery, the huts shed water like the backs of turtles. In New Guinea, where the jungle tried to reclaim every square foot of cleared ground, the steel walls kept the creeping green at bay. On tiny coral atolls barely larger than a football field, where every inch of space mattered, the huts maximized usable area with their self-supporting design. No posts, no beams, no wasted square footage. They became everything the military needed them to be. Hospitals where surgeons operated by lantern light, the curved ceiling amplifying every sound, the clank of instruments, the murmur of morphine-dulled voices, the distant rumble of naval guns. Barracks where exhausted men slept in double-decker bunks, their names and hometowns scrawled on the walls in pencil. Johnny from Brooklyn, Mickey from Chicago, names that would either go home or stay forever in the island earth. Command posts where colonels studied maps by lamplight, their shadows huge and distorted on the curved walls, plotting movements that would save lives or spend them. Mess halls where the smell of coffee and canned beef mixed with cigarette smoke and the ever-present odor of mildew. Radar stations where young technicians watched green screens in the darkness, tracking enemy aircraft, the hut around them humming with electricity and purpose. Chapels where chaplains of every faith conducted services, the curved roof creating an accidental acoustics that made hymns and prayers echo like benedictions in a steel cathedral. Even morgues, where the war's terrible arithmetic was tallied in silence. The first true test came in the autumn of 1943, somewhere in the Gilbert Islands. A typhoon, the kind meteorologists describe with words like catastrophic and unprecedented, rolled across the Pacific with winds that made grown men crawl. The advance warning was minimal. Waves tall as buildings crashed against the shore. Palm trees bent horizontal. And the Quonset huts, those humble steel tunnels, faced their moment of judgment. The soldiers inside could hear the storm screaming across the corrugated steel, could feel the entire structure vibrating like a tuning fork, could see, through gaps in the doors, the world outside dissolving into horizontal rain and flying debris. Every man inside was convinced they would die. Every man was certain the huts would peel apart like sardine cans. They didn't. When dawn broke pale and tentative over the wreckage of the storm, the Quonset huts stood. Tents were gone. Wooden structures were kindling. Supply crates had been scattered across the island like dice. But the curved steel shelters, those practical, unglamorous, American-engineered solutions to an impossible problem, had held. The soldiers emerged into the wreckage and understood, perhaps for the first time, that someone back home had thought of them. That engineers in a cold workshop in Rhode Island had imagined this exact moment and had built accordingly. That they were not alone. But the Pacific was only one theater. Across the world, wherever American forces went, the Quonset huts followed. In North Africa, they appeared in the desert like steel mirages, providing shelter from sandstorms that could strip paint from vehicles and refuge from a sun that could kill as surely as any bullet. Rommel's Africa Corps had fought with legendary mobility, but mobility meant nothing against an enemy that could establish a functioning base in days. The huts went up in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, instant infrastructure in a landscape that had defeated armies for millennia. In England, they lined the airfields where B-17s and B-24s prepared for missions over occupied Europe. Ground crews worked on engines inside Quonset hut hangars while pilots slept in Quonset hut barracks, and in the pre-dawn darkness before raids, men ate breakfast in Quonset hut mess halls, knowing some of them wouldn't return. The huts became part of the geography of war, as familiar as the aircraft themselves, as dependable as the ground beneath their feet. In Italy, they climbed the mountainsides with the advancing Allied forces, providing field hospitals for the wounded from Monte Cassino and Anzio. Surgeons operated inside these steel shells while German artillery searched for their position, and more than one medic swore the curved roof deflected shrapnel that should have torn through canvas and killed everyone inside. Even in the frozen north, the Quonset hut adapted. In Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, where American forces faced not just Japanese invaders but temperatures that could freeze a man solid, the huts were insulated with whatever was available. Sawdust, canvas, layers of cardboard, and heated with oil stoves that glowed red in the darkness. The same design that shed tropical rain shed Arctic snow. The same steel that endured Pacific typhoons endured northern blizzards. On Attu and Kiska, where the Japanese had established a foothold on American soil, the Quonset huts provided the logistical foundation for the counterattack. Soldiers who liberated those fog-shrouded islands moved into huts abandoned by the enemy. The same design, the same basic shelter, proof that good engineering transcends ideology. By 1944, production had reached a fever pitch. Over 160,000 Quonset huts had been manufactured. That's not a number that conveys scale adequately. Try to imagine it. Imagine a line of these structures, end to end, stretching from New York to Los Angeles and back again. Imagine the millions of tons of steel, the billions of rivets, the countless man-hours spent cutting, forming, welding, shipping, assembling. Imagine the industrial coordination required to produce a standardized building at that scale and deliver it to every corner of a world at war. It was, in its own quiet way, as impressive as any weapon the war produced. And the huts evolved. The original 16 by 36-foot model was joined by larger versions, 20 feet wide, 40 feet long, eventually models stretching 50 and even 100 feet in length. They could be joined end-to-end like train cars to create larger spaces. They could be fitted with windows, with proper doors, with wooden floors and electrical systems. What began as an emergency shelter became a modular architecture system, adaptable to nearly any purpose. Seabees, the Navy's construction battalions, became legendary for their speed in assembling these structures. An experienced crew could have a standard Quonset hut up in less than a day. In the urgency of combat zones, with artillery fire audible in the distance and enemy aircraft a constant threat, they worked even faster. There are stories, probably apocryphal, possibly true, of huts going up in under 6 hours, the crews working with the synchronized precision of a pit crew at Indianapolis. Every man knowing his role, every bolt turned with practiced efficiency. What emerged was something unprecedented in military history: the ability to establish a functioning base anywhere on Earth within days of securing the ground. It was force projection through prefabrication, imperialism through industrial efficiency. Where Rome had built roads and England had planted flags, America built Quonset huts. There's a photograph, grainy and faded now, taken somewhere in the Pacific in the summer of 1944. It shows a Quonset hut hospital judging by the Red Cross painted on the curved roof during a Japanese bombing raid. You can see the streaks of anti-aircraft fire in the night sky, the distant orange glow of explosions, and silhouetted against it all, the simple curve of that corrugated steel roof. Inside, we know from after-action reports, surgeons continued operating. They had no choice. The wounded kept coming. Medics held flashlights while doctors worked with steady hands. The entire structure shaking with nearby concussions, dust sifting down from the roof, everyone pretending not to notice. One of the nurses, her name lost to history like so many names from that war, later wrote to her sister that she felt safer inside that steel shell than she had in any building back home. "It's like being inside something alive," she wrote. "Like the hut itself is protecting us." She survived the war. So did the hut. When peace came to the Pacific, it was still standing, still serving, the red cross on its roof faded but visible, a monument to the stubborn persistence of American engineering. But perhaps the most remarkable moment in the life of any Quonset hut came not during combat, but in the strange, suspended reality of military occupation. On countless Pacific islands, in Germany, in Japan itself, soldiers who had fought for years waited in these steel structures for permission to go home. They waited in Quonset hut barracks, ate in Quonset hut mess halls, wrote letters home at desks inside Quonset hut offices. And on a night in August 1945, when word spread that Japan had surrendered, it was inside these humble buildings that grown men wept with relief, that soldiers who had learned to trust nothing dared to hope again. On Okinawa, a mechanic named Thomas Keene, we know his name because he carved it into a roof support, where it remains today, was working on a truck engine when someone shouted that the war was over. He later told his children that the first thing he did was look up at the curved steel roof above him and think about the engineers who had built it, about the factory workers who had manufactured it, about the ship crews who had delivered it, about the assembly team who had raised it. He thought about all the people who had conspired, without ever meeting him, to keep him alive. That Quonset hut had been his home, his shelter, his fortress against a world trying to kill him. And when he finally boarded a ship for San Francisco 3 months later, he touched the steel wall one last time in farewell. The war ended, but the Quonset huts remained. They were too useful, too practical, too well-made to simply abandon. Across the Pacific, on islands that would return to jungle or become strategic outposts of the Cold War, the huts stayed. In Europe, displaced persons, millions of them, found shelter in Quonset hut camps while the world tried to reassemble itself. In America, returning servicemen came home to a housing shortage unprecedented in the nation's history. And once again, the Quonset hut provided an answer. Entire neighborhoods sprang up, street after street of curved steel roofs, veterans and their young families making homes and structures that had been designed for war. They were cheap, a few $100s, sometimes less if you bought surplus. They were quick to erect. And they were, for all their industrial simplicity, surprisingly livable. Windows were cut into the sides. Wooden facades were added to the ends. Interiors were partitioned into bedrooms, kitchens, living spaces. Paint transformed them. Curtains softened them. Gardens grew around them. Children who would grow up to land on the moon, to march for civil rights, to protest wars and build computers and write books. Those children played in yards shaded by the curved steel roofs that had sheltered their fathers during the most terrible war in human history. In the American West, Quonset huts became barns, storing hay and machinery, sheltering cattle during winter storms. On college campuses across the country, they became dormitories, lecture halls, laboratories, temporary buildings that proved so permanent some stand to this day, now protected as historical structures. In small towns from coast to coast, they became churches. Imagine that transformation. A structure designed to facilitate killing, repurposed as a house of worship. Congregations that couldn't afford traditional construction bought surplus Quonset huts, added steeples, installed pews, and held services under those same curved roofs, where soldiers had once sought shelter from artillery fire. The acoustics, that accidental cathedral quality, turned out to be perfect for hymns. In the industrial Midwest, the huts became workshops, small factories, storage facilities. Entrepreneurs starting businesses in the post-war boom bought them surplus and turned them into diners, auto repair shops, even movie theaters. The great American economic expansion of the 1950s happened partly inside repurposed Quonset huts. They were everywhere and invisible, ubiquitous and forgotten, working buildings that had outlived their original purpose and found 1,000 new ones. But the most poignant transformation happened in the places where veterans simply couldn't afford anything else. In rural areas across the South, the Midwest, the West, families made Quonset huts into homes. Not temporary homes while they saved for something better, but permanent homes, the only homes they would ever own. They raised children inside them, celebrated Christmases, birthdays, anniversaries, grew old inside those steel walls. A man who survived Iwo Jima might spend the rest of his life inside a structure identical to the ones that had sheltered him during the war, waking every morning to that distinctive curve of corrugated steel, a daily reminder of survival, of resilience, of the distance between where he had been and where he was now. These huts became vessels of memory. Every creak in a storm recalled other storms. Every summer's heat recalled tropical islands. But they also became something new, proof that weapons can be beaten into plowshares, that the machinery of war can be repurposed for peace, that nothing is only one thing forever. The engineers who designed the Quonset hut never received much recognition. There were no medals, no parades, no dramatic Hollywood retellings of their achievement. They went back to their drafting tables, their universities, their private practices. Some of them probably rode to work past Quonset hut churches and shops without giving them a second thought. But their legacy was literally everywhere. By the end of the 1940s, you could drive across America and never be more than a few miles from one of their creations. They had designed something that outlived the emergency that created it, that proved useful long after its original purpose had passed. In the annals of American engineering, that's rarer than you might think. Most wartime innovations don't survive the war. They're too specialized, too expensive, too compromised by the urgency of their creation. But the Quonset hut was different. It was simple enough to be universal, practical enough to be permanent, and cheap enough to be everywhere. Today, more than 80 years after those first prototypes rose in the Rhode Island cold, Quonset huts are still being built. The design has been refined, updated, improved. Modern versions have better insulation, stronger steel, more sophisticated joints, but the fundamental concept remains unchanged. The same self-supporting arch, the same corrugated steel panels, the same practical elegance that solved an impossible problem in 1942. They're used as airplane hangars, industrial warehouses, sports facilities, even high-end homes for architects who appreciate the honesty of the design. They appear in disaster relief operations, housing refugees from wars and storms, proving once again their adaptability to crisis. The U.S. military still uses them. On bases from Okinawa to Germany, updated versions of the Quonset hut serve many of the same functions they did during World War II: storage, maintenance, temporary housing. They're common enough to be invisible, reliable enough to be trusted with important work, and durable enough that some of the originals, 80-year-old structures that should have fallen apart decades ago, are still standing, still serving, still sheltering whatever needs sheltering. There's something almost mystical about their persistence. These buildings that were supposed to last a few years have lasted generations. These temporary solutions have become permanent fixtures. Walk through the American landscape and you'll find them. Behind industrial parks, on farms, at the edge of small-town airports, half hidden by trees and time. Many have been painted, modified, extended beyond recognition. Others still wear their original corrugated steel skin, weathered to a particular shade of rust and gray that speaks of decades spent enduring sun and rain and snow. Each one is a small monument to the ingenuity of engineers working under impossible constraints, to the industrial might that could manufacture hundreds of thousands of identical buildings, to the soldiers who assembled them under fire and lived inside them through years of war, to the families who transformed them into homes and businesses and churches after the shooting stopped. They're monuments that don't know they're monuments, buildings that never aspired to be anything more than functional, and in that lack of pretension, in that pure dedication to purpose, they achieved a kind of greatness. Consider the mathematics of survival: 160,000 Quonset huts built during the war years. Millions of soldiers who slept, ate, worked, healed, or worshipped under those curved roofs. Thousands of buildings still standing 80 years later. If you could somehow gather the stories of every person whose life intersected with a Quonset hut, every soldier who found shelter, every patient who was saved in a field hospital, every family who made one into a home, every entrepreneur who started a business inside those steel walls, you would have something close to a complete social history of the American 20th century. You would have the story of crisis and response, of industrial power wielded for survival, of practical solutions to existential problems. You would have the story of people making do, making something work, making a life from whatever materials were available. That's what the Quonset hut represents. Finally, not triumph, not dominance, but persistence. The simple determination to build something that will stand, something that will work, something that will keep serving its purpose long after the urgency that created it has faded into memory. In the end, the Quonset hut's legacy is written not in history books but in the landscape itself, in the thousands of curved roofs that still punctuate the American scene, in the DNA of every prefabricated building that came after, in the principle that good design serves its purpose without apology or pretension. Those engineers working in the cold Rhode Island winter of 1942 couldn't have imagined how far their creation would travel, how long it would endure, how many purposes it would serve. They were just trying to solve a problem, to build a shelter that could survive a war. They succeeded beyond measure. They created something humble and indestructible, something that asked nothing more than to be useful and proved that utility could be its own kind of immortality. There's a particular Quonset hut that still stands on what was once a naval air station in the Aleutian Islands. It's been there since 1943, through 80 winters that would kill a man in hours, through winds that have stripped paint from steel and meaning from memory. The base closed decades ago. Most of the other buildings have collapsed or been demolished. But this hut remains, its corrugated steel skin weathered to the color of old bones, its interior empty except for the ghosts of men who once sought shelter there. Occasionally, hikers stumble upon it, this inexplicable structure in the middle of nowhere, and wonder what it is, why it's there, how something so simple has survived so long in a place so hostile to human presence. The answer, if they knew where to look, is stamped into a steel panel near what used to be the door. A manufacturer's mark, a date, March 1943, and below it, barely visible now, the words U.S. Navy Bureau of Yards and Docks. That's all. No explanation, no memorial plaque, no acknowledgement of the lives that intersected with this building or the history it witnessed. Just a stamp in the steel, proof of origin, evidence of purpose. And perhaps that's fitting. The Quonset hut never asked for recognition, never demanded to be remembered. It was built to solve a problem, and it solved that problem so thoroughly, so efficiently, that it transcended its original purpose and became something larger. A symbol, an archetype, a physical manifestation of a particular American genius for practical solutions to impossible challenges. In the hierarchy of World War II technologies, the Quonset hut ranks nowhere near the top. It lacks the drama of the atomic bomb, the romance of the P-51 Mustang, the tactical brilliance of the proximity fuse. But it was there everywhere, the unglamorous foundation upon which all those more celebrated achievements rested. The bombers that flew from English airfields were maintained in Quonset hut hangars. The scientists who developed radar worked in Quonset hut laboratories. The intelligence officers who decoded enemy transmissions did so in Quonset hut offices. The wounded who would have died on previous battlefields survived in Quonset hut hospitals. Every dramatic story of the war, every act of heroism, every strategic victory, happened against a backdrop of these curved steel structures, the infrastructure of triumph, the architecture of survival. The Quonset hut never sought glory, never demanded recognition, never aspired to beauty. It simply stood through storms and wars and decades, and in that standing, in that patient persistence, it achieved something remarkable. It became a quiet miracle of steel and necessity, a testament to what desperate times and dedicated minds can accomplish, a reminder that sometimes the simplest answer is the right one, and that a curved piece of corrugated metal, properly imagined and honestly built, can help save the world. The war ended 79 years ago. The engineers who designed the Quonset hut are gone. The factories that manufactured them have mostly closed or repurposed themselves. The soldiers who assembled them on distant islands and lived inside them through years of combat are nearly all gone too, joining the vast legion of the dead who gave those years their meaning. But the huts remain, still standing, still serving, still sheltering whatever needs sheltering. And in a world that often mistakes complexity for sophistication and decoration for design, there's something profoundly reassuring about that, About a building so simple a child could draw it, so strong it could survive the worst humans could throw at it, so practical it never stopped being useful. Think about what it means that a structure designed in desperation, built in haste, intended to last a few years at most, has outlived most of the permanent buildings constructed at the same time. Think about the churches and schools and homes built with traditional materials and traditional methods during the 1940s that have since crumbled, burned, or been demolished, while these emergency shelters, these temporary solutions, soldier on decade after decade. There's a lesson there about the difference between what we call permanent and what actually persists, about the unexpected durability of honest function over decorative form. The Quonset hut succeeded because it never pretended to be anything other than what it was. A curved piece of steel designed to keep rain out and people safe. That clarity of purpose, that refusal to compromise efficiency for appearance, turned out to be the very thing that ensured its survival. Buildings designed to impress decay. Buildings designed to work endure. And so they stand still, scattered across the landscape like punctuation marks in a sentence we're still writing. These curved steel witnesses to the proposition that sometimes the most revolutionary innovations are the ones that seem most obvious in retrospect. That genius is often found not in complexity but in the elegant reduction of a problem to its essential elements, and that the truest measure of design is not how it looks on the day it's completed but whether it's still standing, still useful, still serving its purpose generations later. The Quonset hut, asked only to do its job, has been doing that job for over 80 years. And if the curve of corrugated steel standing in the rain somewhere in America or Asia or Europe could speak, it would probably say what those engineers would have said, what those soldiers would have said, what anyone who has ever done necessary work without expectation of recognition would say. That it was enough to be useful, enough to serve, enough to stand when standing mattered. That's not a small legacy. That's everything. That's the story written in steel across a century. The story of necessity transformed into endurance, of crisis answered with creation, of the simple curved roof that helped shelter a generation through the storm of total war and then stayed, quietly, patiently, to shelter whatever came after. The Quonset hut doesn't care whether we remember its origin story. It's too busy doing what it was always meant to do. Standing firm, keeping out the rain, and proving that sometimes the most profound achievements are also the most humble.